The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The Berlin Wall isolated West Berlin from communist East Germany and was seemingly an immutable symbol of a divided Europe for years. Then one night in November 1989, the wall came down and Germans from East and West Berlin joined in a celebration. Less than 1 year later, Germany reunified. For those of us old enough to remember the Cold War, the demise of the Berlin Wall seemed like it was something that couldn't possibly happen. How can social scientists explain when this seemingly impossible happens? Well, it turns out that public choice economics offers a way to think about and help explain such unexpected events. And the way we make sense of this has a number of implications for politics at other times, even I think perhaps in the US today. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about public choice and the fall of the Berlin Wall is Dr. John Dove, the Manuel Johnson Professor of Economics at Troy University. John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Dan.
And we're going to change things up a little bit here today, and you're going to be asking me the questions.
That's right.
Okay, so let's get started.
Yeah, so again, one of the big things, as you mentioned, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and for many of our students and many in the audience, they weren't even born at that time. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, kind of the history of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, so at the end of World War II, Germany was partitioned into Allied and Soviet occupation zones, and the Soviet occupation zone became East Germany, and located within East Germany is Berlin, but the majority of Berlin was part of West Berlin, which was under the control of the Allied powers at the time, and then part of West Germany as the partition sort of became seemingly permanent. So Berlin was located well behind, about 100 miles from the border of East and West Germany. And so it was a place where, before the Berlin Wall was built, that residents of East Germany could come over to West Berlin and then move or fly from Berlin into West Berlin, and in effect then get out of East Germany. East Germany closed the main part of its border with West Germany in 1952. But until the Berlin Wall came along, the Germans, or Berliners, were still able to cross over from one sector to the other.
So when exactly was it built then, and why exactly was it built?
Well, the Berlin Wall was built in August of 1961, and it was built because of the massive number of East Germans trying to cross over into West Berlin. In July of 1961, I think around 30,000 people exited to West Berlin. And in the first 10 days or so of August, another, I believe it was close to 13,000. And this was out of a population of East Germany at that time was about 3.5 million people. So this was a pretty significant portion of the population was trying to leave. And so the wall was built. Initially, it was just put up overnight in a barbed wire fence, but eventually it became the structure that was so familiar to those of us at the time.
Well, once the wall itself was built, then did people actually try to cross it still? And if so, what tended to happen?
Well, people tried to cross it, and a number of daring escapes were attempted. And there were guards there that were ordered to shoot to kill to keep people from crossing the wall. It's unclear. We know many people died. The first person who died trying to cross the Berlin Wall happened just a couple of months after the wall was first put up. And estimates differ, but perhaps 100 or 200 people died actually trying to cross the wall. And others, if they were prevented from crossing the wall, it might have ended up committing suicide because they were so intent on trying to get to the West. And I think it's a reminder between the Berlin Wall and then the Iron Curtain that separated Eastern Europe from Western Europe. today socialism has had something of a comeback, but at the time, the communist East Europe, basically they had to build walls to turn their countries into virtual prisons to keep people from leaving to go to the capitalist West at the time.
Huh. So East Germany was obviously part of the Soviet bloc, one of the Soviet bloc countries. So does this actually mean then that the Soviet Union ruled East Germany, or how did that work?
Not directly. If you're old enough to remember, at the time the countries of East Europe were called the satellites of the Soviet Union. They were not directly governed by the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union made it clear that they had an interest in making sure that the nations of Eastern Europe remained friendly. And in a couple of instances, in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviet Union intervened and sent the military in. When the regimes in Hungary, they had a revolution, it looked like they were going to throw the Hungarian Communist Party out of power. And the Soviet tanks went in to say, well, no, that you're not going to do that. So the Soviet Union didn't directly rule these countries, but it was under this implied agreement that the countries were not allowed to, they were free, but they weren't free to not have a communist government.
Okay, sure. So was communist rule actually well established in East Germany now?
It was quite well established, and amongst the various different countries of Eastern Europe, it seemed like the communist rule was perhaps most established in East Germany of all the countries there. It seemed to be pretty well accepted on the citizens. They seemed to be buying in. Erich Honecker was a longtime leader of East Germany. And of course, the regime, as all the communist regimes of Europe had, a significant security establishment. In East Germany, this was called the Stasi, and it was the secret police. And later, when documents were revealed after the regime collapsed, we found out that over 1% of the adult population were members of the Stasi, and perhaps upwards of a quarter of the population were serving as Stasi informants. And so you had a ruthless, but I think also quite effective secret police helping to keep up the regime as well. So East Germany seemed as strong a block in the communist wall as there was in Eastern Europe.
Wow, I didn't know that about the Stasi. So, given kind of the symbolism of the Berlin Wall, it's one thing that many people at least kind of an idea of what is if they weren't there, when it came down or anything. And also the Iron Curtain, they really seemed like permanent features and permanent fixtures in sort of the world of politics and just the world in general at the time, didn't they?
Yeah, it surely did. And, and perhaps maybe for people my age more than anything, because I was born into the world after the Berlin Wall was up. It was the world I grew up into in divided Europe. And it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. And President Reagan, when he was in Berlin in 1987, famously called on Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. And we thought that was just like complete rhetoric, and it was something that, although it would be great to think about, it would never happen, and certainly not in our lifetimes. It seemed permanent. It seemed like the Rock of Gibraltar or anything else in the world, that it wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah, and that's interesting because even as I guess recently as 1987, or in the context of things as 1987, it seemed impossible. But then we see in 1989 the impossible happens. So could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So it's some of the events that happened to us. So we're going to take this in two levels. So first, let's talk about some of the details of what happened in Germany that fall, leading up to November, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the public choice ideas behind this. So, certainly in the mid 1980s, change was afoot in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev had become premier. He had begun glasnost and perestroika, both opening and then restructuring of the economy. The Soviets were tolerating the solidarity movement in Poland that was increasingly sharing some power with the communist government. And so clearly Gorbachev was charting a new course for the Soviet Union, but it was still unclear exactly where things were going to go. In June of 1989, Gorbachev made a statement in which he said, effectively, it was going to be no longer an issue, no longer a matter of national security for the Soviet Union, what type of regime was in place in the nations of Eastern Europe. So it was sort of, that was interpreted, and then as events of that year played out, it interpreted as saying he was no longer going to be sending in the Soviet tanks if one of these countries wanted to chart a separate course. So we certainly had, like, politically with Gorbachev in place, and then I think also economically there were a lot of contradictions. The communist system of East Europe was horribly inefficient, and it was leading into economic stagnation. For a while, high oil prices had helped prop up the Soviet economy, because the Soviet Union was the largest producer of oil at the time. And so the high oil prices had kept, probably during the 70s and early 80s, kept the regime, a bankrupt economy afloat. But the world oil prices collapsed in 1986, and that pretty much was probably the last straw of a badly functioning economic system. They no longer had oil money to help patch things over.
Huh. Interesting, the similarities to certain regimes today. So I guess then in East Germany, right, when we look at the East German regime, they kind of had a stark choice to either try to hold on to power or to give up, isn't that right?
Yeah. And so in what happened in East Germany, beginning in the city of Leipzig, the second largest city in East Germany, there were these Monday evening gatherings, demonstrations, where people were coming out into the streets to actually protest or demand some changes from the government. And at the time, I think in those, every Monday when the crowds gathered and the authorities didn't take action to disperse the crowd, that just simply emboldened more people to show up the next week. And so it was clear that at some point the regime was going to face a choice, that they were either going to have to crack down on these demonstrations or they were going to grow out of control. And especially you can tell from reading the stories that have come out, the regime, the leaders of the regime, and then the people in the military, I mean, simply sort of chose not to. And I think that the best way to think about it is that the system that they had in place for all these years was very clearly clear to everybody. It was not a workers' paradise. This shows East Berlin relative to West Berlin, and in parts of East Berlin they had never even replaced the buildings that had been bombed during World War II. So they hadn't even been able to repair all of the damage from World War II 40 years later. Whereas West Berlin was prosperous and thriving, and people knew that. And, I think Germans throughout, from the citizens all the way up to the top of the regime, knew that this wasn't a workers' paradise. They weren't transforming society into some wonderful utopia of the future. And I think it's just ultimately that there's a ideological malaise or loss of mission, and eventually people came to the conclusion that this bankrupt, dysfunctional regime just wasn't worth killing their fellow citizens to try to keep in power.
Huh. So I guess there's a bigger question then too, to try to understand, how this happened and how it can be such a surprise. And so obviously, social sciences attempt to answer these questions, and economics in particular, interestingly, seems to have some opinions about this and some ways of analyzing this that you've kind of alluded to in public choice theory and public choice analysis. So maybe you could talk about public choice a little bit.
Yeah, so public choice is an area of economics that applies the types of reasoning in economics to phenomena in politics. And in particular, economics deals with the core elements of economics are methodological individualism. So we try to explain everything based on the decisions and actions of individuals. and then also assuming that people are rational and acting in their own self-interest largely. And so we apply this to things like asking, what are the incentives of actual legislators or representatives in a legislature? How would they choose to vote? How would they choose to organize themselves? How would they attempt to try to get reelected? And then, like, what kind of incentives do voters have when they go into say? And to look at the incentives that individuals face there, and how these individuals motivated by these incentives come together and act, and then in the aggregate form, the things like legislation that passes or candidates who get elected or defeated.
Interesting. So in the context of what we're talking about here, has there been any research or work done looking specifically at things like dictatorship or revolution in general?
Yeah, so the majority of public choice scholarship certainly began looking at democracy, and the majority of public choice scholarship has looked at democracies of different forms. But one of the pioneers of public choice theory is Gordon Tullock, the late Gordon Tullock, who helped create a lot of public choice, found public choice with James Buchanan. But Tullock was also very interested in authoritarian governments and dictatorship. And he wrote over the years on revolutions and dictatorship, and a book called Autocracy. And so he's encouraged some public choice scholars, myself included, because I've done some work in this area. I've always been fascinated by the idea of trying to understand exactly what's involved with political power, and why is it that some rulers can attempt to what exactly is the source of power in a society? Is it force? And so I've been fascinated by dictatorship in the politics outside of democracy as well. So there have been a number of us who've studied how, again, applying this idea of looking at things from an individualistic standpoint, and assuming that people are acting rationally to pursue their interests, and how this might help us explain things like revolutions or dictatorship.
Interesting. So can public choice theory also help us understand then the seemingly impossible, like the events that occurred in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall?
I think so, and I think the research that best helps explain this is from an economist named Timur Kran, who's now at Duke University. He wrote a number of papers and then culminated in a book called Private Troops, Public Lies. And in this, he developed an idea, put forward a theory of what he called preference falsification, that I think can go a long way toward explaining these totally unexpected events like the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Could you maybe expand a little bit on this idea of preference falsification?
Sure. So what Cran the view that Cran offered here is that individuals have their true beliefs, their true opinions, and so in an authoritarian regime, it'd be their true inside their heart of hearts, or what they think of the regime. Do they think it's a good thing? Do they support it? Do they oppose it? And that's their personal preference. That's inside of them. But then they also have to periodically make statements in public, or maybe take acts that would either show support or opposition to the government. Once you recognize that there's these two things, you recognize that people who may personally or in their heart of hearts dislike the government can always take an action that could be at odds with that. So in other words, they could make public statements that say, yes, I support the regime. Yes, Eric Honecker is a great man. And yes, this is a true workers' paradise. We're living in this communist regime is a true workers' paradise. You can make statements that would be at odds with or false relative to your true preferences.
And well, kind of in that context, then, how does public support and why does public support actually matter for the government?
Well, public support is going to be important both at the level of if the people are opposed to the government, then they might take to the streets, they might join a rebellion to actively oppose the government. And then also support can help the regime in other ways. All governments, even in authoritarian countries where you think of dictators, rely to a large extent on people to follow the rules. And people can make a choice to either follow the rules or attempt to subvert the rules. Now, certainly there was a lot more subversion of the rules in Eastern Europe. I'm reminded of the famous line where people would say, like, "Oh, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." So, there's clearly some level of like, okay, yeah, people are going through some motions here and taking some action, but still. A government that has to, in effect, force or coerce people to do everything is going to have a very hard time getting anything done. When even a dictator has to give orders and hope that at least their henchmen are going to carry out those orders and willingly carry out those orders and not fail to carry out those orders and say, yes, I did what you told me, but they didn't. And so to some extent, you have to rely on some degree of voluntary cooperation. And so this public support, it can be tied into that, and it can be it can be the types of actions that that could affect significantly whether a regime can actually rule a country or actually accomplish anything.
Huh. So can a highly unpopular government stay in power then?
Yeah. So one of the reasons people could falsify their preferences is that punishments or rewards can be tied to the public statements, and so what you could have is a situation where everybody despises the regime, but they make public statements of support. And in that circumstance, since there are punishments that could be imposed on people, on regime dissenters, people would be sent to the gulag in the Soviet Union. If dissenters could be sent off to prison or executed in earlier years of the Soviet Union. So, given that there are, and more than that, like you could lose your government job. I mean, the government is allocating all apartments. You might lose your apartment. You might not be able to get a car. So when the government is in control of all economic resources, that's another way in which people who dissent from the regime's dissenters could be punished. So you could definitely have a case here where everybody or the regime could be widely despised, but everybody makes public statements in support of it. With public statements in support of it, the regime could stay in power, and even more significantly, appear to be quite popular. If nobody ever voices any opposition, then the regime might appear quite popular. And even though the people, individuals who would know that they themselves don't believe in the regime, they might think that their fellow citizens believe in the regime. They might think that their fellow citizens believe the government's propaganda, believe the things that they're saying. So, yes, I might know I'm lying when I say I think the government's great. I don't know if the other people who are saying that are lying when they're saying that or not. So you can have a situation where nobody would know. Nobody might have any kind of idea just how radically unpopular the government might be. So it really would be a case where, in retrospect, we might be able to understand that yes, this regime was actually quite unpopular. Maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise that the Berlin Wall fell, or that a revolution occurred. But before it happened, it would seem like this was a very popular regime. It's very solid and very, very well established and entrenched, and in no danger of going anywhere.
Huh, that's very interesting. It does seem, though, then in that context, that it really does put a government in a pretty precarious position, huh?
Yeah, it certainly can. And so you can see, why it is that the governments, authoritarian governments, find it so important to try to control public discourse. They have to, there can't be freedom of expression. You can't have a free and independent press. You can't have forums in which people might be able to voice their opposition. And any dissent has to be punished very quickly. Because when somebody dissents and they're not punished, that encourages others to dissent, and it also encourages the others who didn't like the regime. It helps them recognize that others share their dissatisfaction with the regime.
So what kind of events then could actually cause changes like this to occur?
They could be very tiny events, and so it really could be the case of as in one of Professor Cran's papers. He used the line that a spark that could ignite a prairie fire. You have a case here. What we really sort of have is what economists would talk about are multiple equilibria, where yes, it is possible that the regime could be unpopular and stay in power, but it's also possible, given the unpopularity, that they could lose power. And this could be the case where a small event, one person's standing up to a regime or something, could cause something. It could cause a very radical change. 1989 was also the year of the Tiananmen Square events in Tiananmen Square. Again, it could have been something as simple as the one person in Tiananmen Square was standing up in front of the tank and trying to stop the tank. Something like that, some small event could help cause massive change.
Wow, that's interesting. So I guess the preference falsification then, it could apply to the general population, probably does apply to the general population. Can it also apply to, maybe the regime itself in some sense, soldiers or anything like that?
Yeah, I think this applies in both levels. And this gets into some more of the work where I've done some work. And I think you can think of it, both the regime has to be popular among the citizens, but perhaps even more so, it has to be popular amongst the people who are part of the regime. The soldiers, the secret police, the bureaucrats, because if you're trying to plan or run an economy, you have to have bureaucrats who would be, formulating orders, giving orders, and running factories. If those people are members of the government, so you have to have the people who are working for the government believe in what the government's doing as well, and certainly not be opposed to it. And so, I think that was a part of what we saw in East Germany, that even the people in the leadership, even the people in the regime had come to no longer really believe in what they were doing. Of course, with all the pervasive preference falsification, nobody in the military was going to say anything about it. No Communist Party officials were going to say, like, what are we doing here, guys? This is ridiculous.
Right.
So you still had a lot of preference falsification going on there, but this would apply both for the citizens in general and I think for the people in the regime.
So does this then kind of help explain why we might see so much propaganda in authoritarian regimes?
It definitely does. The propaganda is, almost as much, in one extent, directed toward the people who are in the regime. It may not be the citizens necessarily is so important to convince, but you certainly need to keep the military. You need to keep the secret police. You need to keep Communist Party officials believing in the mission. So the propaganda, I think, could be as much directed to the government officials as the population. And then it's also beyond necessarily making sure that everybody believes what you're saying. Making sure that nobody voices disagreement, and because the propaganda sets a message, and then you simply make sure that people have to voice their similar support, and so the propaganda is in effect sort of dominating the discussion and trying to prevent anybody from expressing disagreement with the propaganda.
Interesting. Do you see, this research, preference falsification, and some of the other things we talked about as well, do you see that also being applicable to more democratic regimes and democratic politics?
It certainly can. There are a number of different ways this could apply. I think sometimes you see that somebody could be the Speaker of the House and suddenly lose support. And I think a lot of times what you see there, that there is probably some preference falsification going on. Nobody wants to go against the Speaker of the House because they have a lot of perks that they could give him. But once something happens and everybody realizes, oh, we all want this person gone, things can happen very fast. Well, we've come to the end of our time. Thanks for coming on, John, and asking me these questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.